Hello, welcome to my channel, Anglican Aesthetics. I'm really excited to be joined by Steve Baughman. He is a very intelligent atheist, and he has a great story. A lot of you actually might be familiar with his story. What we want to do here is sort of dialogue through the evidences for the existence of God and see what picture of reality we can, if any, that we can come to agree on or come to see each other's perspective. Yeah. So, Steve, do you wanna introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's Steve Baughman, and I present publicly as an atheist because I actually don't believe in God. But I'm aware that label has a lot of baggage that makes it sound like I'm anti-religion, and I'm not. I also consider myself a cultural Christian very loosely. I call my mother almost every weekend to encourage her to go to church on Sunday. I'm a musician. I've published lots of gospel guitar arrangements. There's a lot about Christianity that I love. I just happen to not think it's true, and I don't think there's a God, but I'm not really smart enough to be 100% sure of that. So some of the more dogmatic atheists would consider me a traitor to the tribe and more of I should go join the agnostic club down the road. But I think atheist works for me just because no matter how badly I want something, I don't pray about it. And I am on an intuitive level very comfortable with naturalism, the causal reality being all that there is without any sort of supernatural stuff. So that's where I am. I should say I grew up in Southeast Asia around and was very influenced by missionaries, hung out with the missionary kids were the cool kids. They got all the best roles in the musicals. They were the star athletes. They were the nicest kids. They were nice to me. I was very impressed by the missionaries living lives of no luxury at all out there in hardship posts across Indonesia. And I came to the U.S. when I was 18, got saved. I'd gotten saved a few times in Asia also. That's a whole other story, but none of them lasted, and got saved in the United States at a Southern Baptist church in California. I had no bad experiences with the church, but I found myself constantly feeling a little inauthentic about my beliefs. I just couldn't completely believe it. There's that still small voice that kept saying, "You're faking this, Steve." And I was. And after about 2 years or so, I just admitted to myself that no matter how hard I pray, no matter how much I study the word, no matter how many meetings I have with my pastors or senior Bible people in my community, I just could not get that damn still small voice to shut up. And I admitted to myself that I'm actually a doubter. And now I'm more than a doubter. I'm a fairly convinced atheist, but depending on which day you ask me, my certainty might be between 97% some days and 84% some other days. And given your resume, Luke, Sean, you may get me down to a 50-50 by the end of our
We'll see. I don't know. But
and
yeah,
by the way, that's okay with me. It's like I want to be right. I don't care about winning debates.
Yeah.
I want to have correct views, and it's really a long, hard slog. I've done taken lots and lots of classes at Christian schools, and if there's something out there that I'm really missing, let me know sooner rather than later.
Yeah. And that's great. And I don't know if you want to share any of your story. Some people might be familiar with that, but feel free to.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. Yeah. You mean like right now?
Yeah. Just as a little bit of an introduction to that. Yeah.
I'll tell you that this is water under the bridge, but just in case some of your viewers don't know, I assume some of them know, but many of them probably don't. Until about 9 years ago, I was very impressed with and emotionally favorably disposed to institutional Christianity. I liked Southern Baptists. I didn't like their politics, but even conservative Christianity, I thought, boy, I disagree with those folks, but they're good, honest people, including at the highest levels of leadership. And I took Bill Craig to dinner once. I've been impressed with Christian character. Then in 2015, I came across a guy named Ravi Zacharias, who went to your seminary, and began being very influenced by some of the arguments he made. And I decided that given his academic qualifications, by the way, I have that exact coffee mug you're drinking out of. Quit showing it to me. It's going to distract me. Where was I? Yeah. His tremendously impressive academic credentials, doctorates in Cambridge and Oxford appointments and all that sort of stuff. And I thought, well, this guy's qualified enough and smart enough that if these arguments he's making probably have a lot to them, and I'm going to change my worldview if I look into these and find out that he's right. And I began looking into him, and I scratched the surface and found a patent fraud. Ravi Zacharias was just a cheater through and through. Took a few hours of online research to discover that, and that was okay. One phony does not condemn the whole religious institution, but then I noticed that the people around him were in pari delicto. They were in cahoots with him to preserve his reputation. And then I discovered that it wasn't just his organization, it was every Christian organization I contacted with mountains of evidence about this guy's, first of all, academic fraud, then sexual misconduct. They didn't want to hear it. They kept, they treated him like he was going to be canonized as Saint Ravi after he dies, and they did. And that was really an eye-opener for me. And I've been pretty darn cynical about religious institutions ever since. I used to think if someone's a man in a pulpit, I used to admire, because no matter how wrong he was leading a good life, pursuing something that he believed. Now I think the chances are that he's probably a sleazebag, and it's his burden to show that he's not. I mean, that's really where I am right now. There's just so much sleaziness in Christianity all over the world. And so I'm very cynical about it. Doesn't make the religion wrong, lowers the probability ever so slightly, but it's not I encourage my fellow atheists not to hammer on Christianity because of all the nasty Christians out there, That doesn't mean Jesus didn't rise. It just means they probably don't really believe he rose and some other things, but it's not a hammer to be used against the religion that there's bad Christians. So that's basically where I am right now. I've taken a bunch of classes I try to take all my studies with Christians. I've been at the Dominican school in Berkeley for taking classes for years, the Graduate Theological Union. I may be enrolling in a master's program in Catholic theology this fall, because I want to get a handle on Aquinas and Thomism. And so I remain very engaged and interested. So there you have it.
Well, that's great. And thanks for sharing that. And, I sympathize there, and I do think, especially given people's resistance to at first when some of the stuff about Ravi started coming out, and the way people sort of gathered around him, that is really disillusioning. And I'm sorry for that, that happened.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I should say that I don't know that there's anything to be sorry about me for. I learned something. I learned a truth that I was very naive about. So it was nothing but, other than it being a tedious process and a little bit depressing being insulted so much. Overall, it was a learning experience, and that made it a good thing for me. So thank you anyway.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so hopefully I kind of want to get into some of that discussion about, let's see what the reasons are for theism, for Christianity, and then sort of go from there. So I know, or maybe you're not, but how familiar are with the argument from consciousness?
Yeah, so it's funny that you're asking about that at the opening. I was going to concede at the beginning of our interview that there's two areas where I'm willing to put a point, 2 points in the theist column. One is why is there something rather than nothing, and the other is consciousness. I know Josh Rasmussen. I know something about his work. I've taken philosophy of mind. I really have nothing interesting to say about consciousness other than I think the theists have the better argument with a massive asterisk by it, depending on what science discovers over the next 5,000 years.
Yeah.
I'm really reluctant to take a position because I think it's ultimately going to turn out to be an issue that we need a lot more data on.
Sure.
Even the hard problem of consciousness, and I think it's a little bold to approach anything like having a final opinion that can only exist with God. But that's where I am right now. You guys have the better of us on that point.
Sure. And here's what I want to argue then and I'm curious for your thoughts on this. So it's funny, I actually just submitted this paper today. It's on an article that thank you. I'm working on. We'll see what happens. 9 out of 10 times a paper gets rejected. So we'll see what happens. But it's called the descriptive challenge. So my argument is that it's metaphysically actually impossible for consciousness to be reducible to the brain. And here's sort of why. Sort of with the law of identity, right? If A is equal to B, if they're the same thing, then whatever is true of A is true of B, right? Just by sort of identity. I think then it would follow that, and I'll define what I mean by these terms, that a de re description of A is a de re description of B. Now, what I mean by that is a description of the thing itself. So, for instance, you might say, are the morning star and Venus, is Venus and the morning star identical, right? People might distinguish between those conceptually, even though they actually are identical. A de re description would be describing the object in and of itself, whereas a de dicto description is just sort of saying things about it without talking about the object in and of itself. It's a rough sort of way of articulating that distinction. But
I'm sorry. So run this by me. The de dicto view of the morning star versus the evening star versus the de re. What would the de re description be?
Yep. So that's a really good question. So it would be if I were to sort of look through a telescope at the landscape of Venus and then start picking out things about the landscape.
De dicto.
Right. That would be de re. That would be de re.
Oh, that's de re. Okay.
Yeah. So another example actually that gets commonly quoted is this was back when the number of planets was 9 before Pluto got down. But Saul Kripke talks about is the number of planets necessarily greater than 7? Now, in one sense, right? Yes. If we're just talking about the de re sense, actually, but in another sense, no, right? The number of planets could have been different. But then if we're talking about the number of planets when we're considering the number in and of itself, that would be a de re description. Okay. Does that make sense? So 9 in and of itself is necessarily greater than 7, but it's not necessarily the case that the number of planets, quote unquote, is greater than 7. So the way I sort of cash this out is in terms of thinking about intrinsic properties. So if I have my dog there and I sort of shrink the world down to that dog, right, and I start picking out things about that dog. So her fur is black, or she's a canine. That would sort of be the kind of de re description I'm getting at, a description of intrinsic properties. And so the argument then is, if consciousness is identical to brain stuff, then a description of the intrinsic properties of consciousness should be a description of the intrinsic properties of its brain stuff, of the brain stuff with which it's identical, and vice versa, right? So an intrinsic description of those brain properties should be a description of your conscious experience. Now, the scenario, I sort of tweak Mary the color scientist and say, all right, well, if you have Mary, the Taylor Swift fan, right, who's listening in the Eras tour, can you describe what she's hearing by describing what's going on in her brain? So let's say I'm just sort of articulating intrinsic properties about her brain states. The argument is that because, if she were to say, describe to me what I'm hearing, and I just sort of rattle off facts about her brain states, I wouldn't be describing what she's hearing. Like she wouldn't be able to say that's what it sounds like if I were to just rattle off facts about her brain states. And therefore, consciousness is not identical to the brain. So that's sort of the argument. What are some of your thoughts on?
So I mean, I know that Frank Jackson with the whole Mary color thing changed his mind on this, didn't he?
Right, he did.
I just wonder if there's something question begging about it. I mean, what are you going to say if I bite the bullet and say, no, Sean, if you know everything about the brain states of the person listening to Taylor Swift, you actually do know what her experience is. The only way to refute that is by saying, no, you don't. And then we're just begging the question. I mean, does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. So this is that's a fair point. So this is an important tweet, because I agree one could say that. But then if I pivot to sort of describing intrinsic properties, it seems to be a little bit more clear that if I'm describing Mary's sort of, the neurochemistry, I'm not even getting close to describing like what it sounds like to her.
How do you know that? I mean, that would be true. I mean, I'm not that my instinct is that you're absolutely right, but this is really where the battleground lies.
Right.
And how do we know that? It's like, I remember in my philosophy of mind class, a similar argument. Ned Block, I think it was, has the Chinese nation theory of mind. Like, if you have, let's say there's 10 billion neurons in our brain, and they all move around a certain way, and that gives rise to consciousness. Well, let's say China had 10 billion people that work the way our brains do. Would that be a mind? Well, our instincts are, no, but one of the students raised his hand and said, well, why not just bite the bullet and say it would be a mind? Sure. Yeah. And that's kind of a hard question to answer.
Yes. Yeah. And that's a fair point. I think one of the benefits of description is that if I'm like, so my dog's right next to me, if I start describing like, I don't know what, like if you ask me, what does my dog's fur look like? And I start saying it's really sunny, right? Like that sort of answer is just sort of like manifestly not about the blackness of her fur. So I think by pivoting to description, at least my hope is that I get around some of those knowledge type objections, that now it's no longer just about knowing what's in her brain. In trying to describe it, given that descriptive entailment referred to earlier, it seems manifest that my descriptions are not a description of what Mary the Taylor Swift fan is hearing.
I get that, but I'm not getting your pivot move. I'm still back in, well, how do we know that? And let's just go back to Mary, the colorblind scientist, and say, if she really knows all the physical facts about color, I mean, the thought experiment, for those who don't know, is the brilliant scientist, colorblind, or she was captive in some black and white laboratory and never got to see color, but she learned every single thing there was to possibly know about color. And then one day she went outside and saw color for the first time. And the question is, did she learn something when she saw color, right? And is that a fair description of the knowledge argument? Totally. And if you say, yes, she learned something about color when she saw it, that means that the experience of color is not reducible to all the physical facts about color. But how do we know then that when she went outside, she wouldn't just, I wrote a paper in my philosophy of mind class called Mary Shrugged.
Yeah.
Mary gets out of the lab and she already knows all about the color. She knows everything about it. So when she sees red, says, yep, I already knew that. And I'm not comfortable with that intuitively, but I don't want to let my intuitions be the answer for me. I mean, does that make sense? Like, I don't know what.
And that's fair. I think with description, like when I think about, a neurosurgeon doing brain surgery or something like that, when they're describing the physiology of the brain, it like, so would you agree that like, as we're describing physiology, and this would be question begging if I made an argument from this, but at least as we know neuroscience right now, when a brain neuroscientist is sort of cutting into the brain and they might be describing what they're doing and describing the anatomy, that's not a description of a song that Mary's here, or at least at that from what we know now.
Can I just ask you,
Yeah.
you're using song for our Mary thought experiment instead of color. Is there a reason
So what
for
is,
that?
that's a good question. So namely because color in itself is sort of hard to describe to another person.
Okay.
So it's hard for, if someone hasn't seen red, it's hard for me to describe what red looks like.
Fair enough.
So description is, I think, a more at least a more communicable experience.
Well, and Taylor Swift is in the news a lot these days.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay,
right. So it's a common intuition.
Okay. Yeah.
So she's hearing the song. She's heard the song. At least as we know neuroscience right now, it seems like if you cut into the brain and you sort of describe the physiology, one's not even getting close to describing the song as Mary hears it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I suppose I was listening to a lecture by David Chalmers the other day, one of the foremost philosophers of mind, and one of my general approaches as a non-expert in really anything. I mean, I think I'm an expert banjo player, and that's about it. Which I'm happy about, but I wish I was more expert in other things too. But one of the approaches I have got to use in forming my provisional opinions on things is what's the consensus amongst the experts.
Mm-hmm.
And when great philosophers of mind are saying, we're working on that hard problem thing, I just can't help but think that in 1,000 years, we'll be looking back on this sort of quaint discussion Steve Baughman and Sean Luke had about mind, and I'm just hesitant to reach a confident conclusion one way or another about it. And I'm not comfortable with my provisional opinions on mind. I mean, I'm more in your camp. There's got to be more than just brain activity that accounts for Mary seeing color or the experience of hearing music, but I just don't know.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think that's fair. I do think, when we think about how scientific investigation works, we sort of proceed from what we know, so from what we know about the Earth, it seems like the Earth is old, and I would hold to an old Earth. Now, in theory, it's possible that could change. It's not likely that it'll change, but it's possible. It seems like what we can do is from the sort of law of identity, which is a very base, like a very sort of it's at the base of knowledge. The law of identity is that we can actually adduce from that law stuff about the brain. We can actually apply the law of identity to the brain, and then through this descriptive entailment, get evidence that actually consciousness isn't reducible. That's possible. I don't know that I have anything else to offer on that.
Fair
enough. Yeah, fair enough. And we can move on from consciousness.
I still if I had to vote right now, I'd vote theism on that. On consciousness, with a big asterisk by it that I don't know, and give us 1,000 years. I guess I'd want to know, what do you think do you think the state of neuroscience in 1,000 years, I mean, I'm trying to really stretch it out, when it's really, really, really advanced, isn't going to change? It will add nothing to your view on this?
Yeah, it's a good question. Randy? It's a very good question. So
also, sorry, I know what my point about the scientific consensus being where I put a lot of my provisional beliefs right now. Yes, there is a strong scientific consensus that the world is round. It could change, but the scientific consensus is not just that the world is round, it's also very strong that that's never going to change.
Right.
The
Yeah.
scientific consensus now
That's
about
fair.
reducibility of mind may be strong, maybe not, but I don't think there's a strong consensus
That's
that
true.
we're not
Yeah.
going to know anything new. It's
Right.
still going to be that way in 1,000 years. So that's why I'm more hesitant than I think
That's
you
fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's fair. There is a disanalog there. My point is just that consensus, though consensus in and of itself, it can function for sure as evidence towards a particular view or evidence towards caution. But I do think that even in controverted issues, if there's an argument that rests on something like the law of identity, then that's a very, so, to answer that question, in 1,000 years, will neuroscience actually change the view, or could it change the view I hold? So the reason I think what neuroscience could definitely do is probably map and correlate, maybe it can do this, can correlate conscious experiences to brain states. So it's possible even that, a camera could sort of project my conscious experience on the screen, in correlating that to brain states. But I'd argue that because this depends on the law of identity, this specific argument and the descriptive entailment would actually be untouched by that. So that's actually one reason I think it's stronger. We'll see. I think it's stronger than Frank Jackson's argument.
May I ask, just before we move on, is this a point that you've come up with?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Well,
intriguing. Yeah.
Yeah, but we'll see. So it's totally fair for you to be skeptical. So I totally understand that. I think the argument works.
Well, it's totally fair that my head's exploding also, because it's not like this is something I should have learned in philosophy of mind.
No.
My hat's off to you for thinking of this. It's something I will ask you more about privately, because I'd like to learn more about it. It's very intriguing.
For sure. So there, then, if we sort of say the evidence kind of points towards, even if we think it's not conclusive, points towards at least non-physicalism, it seems then from there we have a picture of reality that isn't purely reducible to the physical. Would that be fair?
Yeah, that's a big if, given what we just talked about. But yes,
totally.
Yeah. I mean, once you open the door up to non-physicalism, there's cans of worm. There's worms crawling everywhere, and a lot more things become worthy research projects and worthy of So yeah.
Well, and that's why to agree with your point earlier. That's why I just think this format of dialogue is, because we sort of naturally will get sort of open and dovetail into those questions. I think that's actually really helpful. Now, the other point then in favor of non-naturalism, so not sort of theism yet, but this sort of non-physicalist picture of reality, is the sort of grounding that I want to hold, and I'm curious what you think about this, that people actually everyone has equal objective dignity. What do you think about that claim?
I don't know what it means. I'm not trying to be a jerk, but I go through this a lot with people ask me, well, you're an atheist. Why is stealing wrong? I don't know what wrong means, And tell me what wrong means, and I'll maybe be able to answer. If wrong is reducible to messes society up, then stealing's wrong.
Sure.
But then the comeback is always, no, but that just means it's reducible. You're just reducing it to something. But I want to know, is stealing really wrong?
Yeah.
And I don't know what that means. And I don't know what people have objective dignity means.
Yeah. So, and that's a fair point. Here's the kind of definition I'm thinking of let's sort of think about that issue of right and wrong. That definition of wrong, so that would sort of be a pivot from dignity. So I think that's absolutely fair. So I'm just going to sort of pivot to morality, because I think you're right that it's notoriously difficult to define dignity. And I do think there is a definition, but sort of already when you presuppose theism and yeah, which then doesn't serve as evidence for theism. So, which is fair. Now, with moral facts, I think I'd want to say that wrong would mean something like someone who thinks that stealing is okay is incorrect about their moral beliefs. They have a false moral belief. Or like, so something with Ravi, right? Like for Ravi to think it was okay for him to use ministry funds to exploit women, he was wrong, just really clearly wrong, to believe that.
So you're basically advancing the non-natural moral realist view.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. And
yep.
I'm still stuck with you using a normative term to define a normative concept. So I'm not following you, because then I'm just going to say, well, what was wrong about it? Well, it hurt the human. Okay.
Right.
Let's talk about that.
So the belief would be, so far then, I think I'd want to say, at least at this stage, that the moral belief he held is false. So instead of a true belief, it's a false moral belief.
Yeah. I just don't know what that, I don't know. I mean, again, not trying to be a jerk.
Sure.
I don't know what, I always feel like when I have this discussion, I'm like the annoying 4-year-old who says, why shouldn't I hit my sister? Well, because you made her cry. Well, why shouldn't I make her cry? Well, because it harms her. Well, why shouldn't I, I mean, it's really irritating, and I'm sorry I'm that way, but I just am.
Yeah.
I really think that one of the missing pieces in meta ethics, even though I'm not an expert, and certainly in popular discussions about ethics, is well, we're all like Wittgenstein with his beetle in a box. You've got a box with your insect in it. I've got a box with my insect in it. We both refer to them as beetles, but we never see what's in each other's boxes. We could be miles apart in our descriptions, and until we decide what the hell a beetle is, we're not really communicating. And until we decide, well, what exactly is wrong, it's really not good enough to say, not that you're saying this, but we all have intuition. Come on, Steve, you know what wrong is. You know that the Holocaust was wrong. No, until you tell me what it's like, don't tell me the Empire State Building is a widget without telling me what a widget is.
Sure. How about that to which moral? So when I think about sort of the different kinds of emotions humans have, right? Mm-hmm. So fear sort of indicates, at least not necessarily that there really is something in the environment which ought to evoke that, but it indicates that there are at least potentially things in the environment that ought to evoke fear, and to which fear answers. Moral outrage seems to be a particular kind of emotion. So it's right to be like, it's certainly well, backing up from right, because that's kind of questionable.
Don't use that word, because
right.
Be annoying again.
Yeah. So so it's the feeling moral outrage at Ravi Zacharias is fitting. Mm-hmm. So I think I would define wrong as that to which moral outrage answers.
I'm morally outraged at Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'm morally outraged at lots of things that other people would not be morally outraged at. I mean, you're sort of appealing to consensus now. So
moral outrage there would just be more of the view that emotions are sort of perceptual. There are at least perceptual emotions.
Yeah.
So fear, for instance, is a perceptual emotion. I would want to say moral outrage, what the wrongness is whatever is perceived by the emotion of moral outrage.
Can moral outrage misperceive?
Yes.
Okay, so then, but doesn't that undermine your?
Oh, that's yeah. So, and I would need to modify that. So yeah, and that's a fair point. Yeah. Wrongness then would be that which fittingly evokes moral outrage in an analogous sense to how things in the environment can either fittingly or unfittingly evoke fear.
Okay, I think this is this is one of the reasons I'm interested in going to a Catholic master's program to figure out what the hell Aquinas and the Thomists said about it, the Aristotelians say about it, because you and I are sort of grappling with some definitional, something that we can come up with that's immune to counterexamples. And I don't know that that's possible.
Sure.
And whereas the Aristotelians sort of say, well, our nature is, our telos is directed towards sort of a eudaimonia or flourishing, and that which furthers that as in furtherance of our nature is the good, or is obviously I haven't done my homework on that. I'm just intrigued by it. Like it's a way of circumventing either moral non-naturalism, these sort of spooky properties floating around out there, and reductionism, which is, well, that which furthers pleasure is good, and that which undermines or furthers flourishing is good, and that which undermines human flourishing is bad. But where I am on it, I'll just lay my position out. I think that it's like baseball. So, Sean, let me ask you this. Does baseball exist?
Yes.
Okay. Why do you say baseball exists?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm kind of actually a realist about social construction. So Peter Berger's social construction of reality. Like I think actually social institutions and social games even have a reality to them that's emergent in social interactions. So yes, and applied to morality. Well, so the way I think that's going is sort of morality is analogous to the rules we set for baseball. And I think there's a kind of objectivity there, but would that be where you?
Yeah. So I would say, if you and I can agree that baseball exists, why do we? God is. We don't trace our reason for believing that baseball exists to God.
Right. Yep. Right.
So why do we need to trace our belief that morality exists to God? I'm really comfortable. I mean, I know Sam Harris is not cool to quote in philosophical circles because he's not a philosopher, but I like the idea that, hey, I put my hand on a hot stove. I don't like it. I move my hand. I ought to move my hand. Why ought I move my hand? Well, because I really don't like it. It causes a lot of displeasure, and I can build. That's my beachhead to a morality, and I don't want you to burn your hand either, and I don't want the person in Uganda to burn their hand either. And we agree that it's immoral to cause it's wrong to cause other people to burn their hands, just like we agree that baseball exists. We don't need any fancy metaphysics. It's a social construction.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, good.
For you, sorry to interrupt, but my question for you is, if you're a social constructionist about a lot of things like baseball, why not about morality?
Yeah, good question. Great question.
Are you?
No. So I'm not. And so there we want to test. So with any sort of ethical theory, we'd want to test it, against sort of counterexamples to see if it stands up. So what I'd expect with baseball, right? I do think there can actually be a wrong way to play baseball within that social system that's been set up. If morality, though, if we think, if we ask the question, would it be wrong for society to change the rules of baseball? To that question, it seems like no, because society precedes that system. So can we say that sort of thing about morality? And there, it seems like actually, if society decided, as it did for a large part of history, that women are inferior to men, right? Like, which was just a common stock assumption for the vast majority of history, then society is actually wrong. It should, to make progress, would be to actually dispense with that view. And that tells me that it's actually not analogous to the rules of baseball or to a socially constructed thing like that.
So when they implemented the designated pitcher rule into the National League a few years ago, I know someone who was so upset about that he thinks baseball no longer exists. And I can easily conceive of a community of diehard baseball people whose lives revolve around the value. Baseball brings so many good things: community, challenge, fitness, compassion, integrity, baseball. And yes, it is wrong to not make pitchers take their turn at bat. That is not baseball. It's wrong.
Yeah. 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 And so there, like, I think the fact that the norms by which you'd adjudicate that question are different would tell against morality being a social construction. So there, the norms that would settle that question in the case of baseball would be the agreement of the community. But now, if the sort of human community agreed that women are inferior to men, they've in fact actually settled it in the wrong direction. Whereas that can't be actually said of the baseball community.
Okay, so why not?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. I guess so. It's because of that assumption, my own sort of stock assumption that that men and women are equal is sort of the North Star guiding moral assumption. So that's fair. So I guess then I would ask you, like, if the human community sort of decided or reverted back to its older judgment that women were inferior to men, like, would you then want to say that then that would be right? In the same way that if society changed the rules of baseball, then those are the new rules.
Sorry, I'm just thinking aloud here. Forgive me if this sounds stupid.
No worries.
I'm wondering if we're sort of conflating the importance of an ontological existence, or the importance of a thing with its ontological existence. So, in other words, we can probably agree that the value of women is more important to human flourishing than the designated pitcher rule.
Sure.
The designated hitter, whatever you call it. Sorry, I don't do sports. Sure. So anyway, but that doesn't, I don't know that means that one is more a social construction or less a social construction than the other.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Like, yeah, sure. So that, go for it.
Because if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying that there's a lot more at stake with the gender equality than designated hitter thing. Wait, is it designated hitter or designated pitcher? I
have no idea.
Let's just stipulate. Let's just socially construct that it's called the designated hitter. Okay, good. So one, they're both socially constructed equally, but one is more important than the other. But I think you're taking that the fact that one is more important gives it some sort of different ontological grounding, and I'm not sure.
Yes. So my argument isn't that because it's more important to human flourishing that we consider women as equal to men in dignity, that therefore we ought to. My argument is more that if society, it seems to me, so I'm curious what you think about this. What it seems to me like is that if the baseball community changed the rules of baseball and sort of agree, there's that initial disagreement and they work through that and they settle in a particular direction, that's licit within the sort of construct of baseball. But then when we think about morality, if the human society from which morality was allegedly socially constructed decided in the direction of women being inferior to men, they have in fact decided wrongly. Like, we should actually try to change that consensus.
Why?
Would you agree with that? And it's okay if you don't.
I would say I don't know what reasoning there would be for that other than human flourishing, broadly construed.
Yeah. Which is fair. So then let's sort of test that human flourishing, because I do think that would be the most potentially one of them. I don't think it's very plausible. I think it's the most plausible sort of like physical objective basis. My objection to sort of Harris's view there, so like right and wrong are the maximization of human flourishing, right? Mm-hmm. So he would want to say something like, if a guy's shooting up a theater, it's right to shoot that guy because it maximizes human flourishing. So even though you're cutting off the shooter's flourishing, you're nevertheless maximizing flourishing on the whole. The problem with that sort of reasoning is that it leads to it can lead to pretty jarring counterexamples. For instance, if we found out that it would lead to sort of more maximal flourishing to sort of just kill the elderly, right? For society to not support the elderly.
Yeah.
Then it would seem to follow on that idea that that's actually what we should do. Whereas I look at that and I sort of think that's a society where we don't care for the elderly, where we just sort of kill them off at a particular age. That's bad. We shouldn't want that. Which tells me that human flourishing is in itself the standard by which I'm adjudicating moral questions.
Mm-hmm.
At least not by itself.
So you're saying Harris's view has the same problems that utilitarianism has.
Right, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, why would we argue that killing off all the old, how would one argue that killing off all the old people serves human flourishing?
Yeah. So that, society sort of has a social safety net where there's, social security, and there are sort of added health costs that are, that go into taking care of the elderly. From my perspective, that's just a responsibility society has, though you could make a sort of economic argument that actually, like, if at a certain age, if we didn't spend those resources, we could sort of reinvest them. And we just sort of euthanized.
Yeah, I guess the kind of human flourishing that I think most people envision just would say that doesn't serve flourishing. I mean, you're basically talking about the lifeboat cases. Well, sometimes we do have to kill somebody and eat them.
Sure.
Yeah, maybe sometimes you do. Maybe there's lifeboat cases where that's the right thing to do. I don't know, but I'm sort of reluctant to build a meta ethics on these extreme thought experiments or these extreme counter examples. Of course, they're relevant, but I guess I'm getting back to what exactly is it about killing all the elders that serves human flourishing? You're right. There's resources. There was not enough resources. Well, if as a scientific matter, it really is going to mean lots of children die because we're letting these old folks live to be beyond 75, then that might change the calculus. I mean, maybe when it does become an issue of human flourishing, that you got to kill off certain people. I mean, there's societies in Star Trek where when you turn 70, you report for execution.
Right. Yeah. I was thinking actually exactly that.
Is that wrong? I don't know. The question for me would be, does that serve flourishing? And boy, yeah, it sure makes me uncomfortable if we suddenly reach a scientific consensus that 75th after your 75th birthday, we kill you. Sorry, it's just the way it goes. Yeah, that makes me really uncomfortable. But I don't know what the human. I could see how it would be consistent with human flourishing in certain extreme examples. Oh my God, I don't want this to be quoted as Steve Baughman. Is he the guy?
That's not my intention. Definitely not.
Let's kill him at 75. I just don't know. Since we're talking about bizarre hypotheticals, I could probably come up with bizarre hypotheticals where, yes, it would serve flourishing to do horrible things to some people.
Right. And so that's sort of in my mind, it's not necessarily, so to take actually even maybe a more realistic example, at least more viable, there seems to be, and I think this is one of the reasons I don't identify as Republican is because I think I don't identify as Democrat either, but it's because I think there's a lot of coldness on the right towards people.
Coldness or coldness?
Yeah, coldness.
Coldness.
Though coldness around Trump, that's but there's a lot of coldness on the right, I think, and if you think about a sort of city like San Diego, or not San Diego, like Los Angeles, right, which has a massive homelessness problem right now, there have been some that have argued, we should kick them out or deport them or whatever, right? And the argument there goes that, well, all of these welfare programs are putting collective strain on the society, right? I think it would be a bad idea if someone said, and even if you had a computer, right, that could sort of calculate a solution, some sort of AI computer that told us that actually just killing them would increase flourishing than not killing them. Flourishing of humans would be higher than if we just didn't kill them. I would say, yeah, we probably still shouldn't kill them.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think that you're hitting on the difference between act utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism.
Sure.
It may be that killing them, the act of killing them serves human flourishing, but the general rule that you kill people does not serve human flourishing. I'd be really hard pressed to come up with. I wouldn't trust the smartest AI computer to, if we get, I wouldn't trust that sort of a calculation.
Yeah. So that's important. So then my critique of sort of rule utilitarianism in general is that it actually, I think at least, and I know there are people who would disagree with me on this, that it reduces to act utilitarianism. And the reason is because a rule can be specified. So the principle on which someone would act actually operates according to sort of specified rules. And similarly, it seems to me that the rule here is not that would be implemented is not just kill people in general, which both the act and rule utilitarian could say, yeah, that's a bad move. But it's more so kill those who it would be beneficial to kill when that tends towards the maximization of human flourishing. And so then at that point, rule utilitarianism just sort of collapses into act utilitarianism.
Yeah, except it's always vulnerable to the argument that no, there are no such situations where there are very, very few situations, only bizarre hypotheticals under which killing those people would serve human flourishing.
I don't think it's actually necessarily so. One concrete instance in history, I think, where this sort of reasoning has been used was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the logic used for them was that dropping the bomb would actually result in less loss of life. I still think dropping the bomb was wrong. So given that, it seems like that sort of scenario, given that it's happened, actually, it's not implausible because people have used that sort of reasoning.
So I think what's coming up for me now is we're sort of falling. Was it William James or John Dewey about the quest for certainty? Like we're doing what philosophers do. Not that I am a philosopher, but I love it. But we're sort of trying to figure out how to deal with all these counterexamples to find out what is the gold standard of moral behavior. And I sort of reject that. I'm with Richard Rorty. We muddle through on a grand scale.
Sure.
And with James also saying a twig does not dam a river. Counterexamples are fun to come up with. Boy, are they fun. And, Gettier made a career out of it, or at least a reputation out of it. But ultimately, I wouldn't go from there's counterexamples to all these these non-theistic moral realist theories. They're subject to counterexamples, therefore moral theism.
Sure.
Therefore God.
Right? I agree that would be a leap. So
I should also say, sorry, just let me finish my point. I'm also a moral anti-realist.
Sure.
I don't think there is such a thing as right and wrong. So these are really interesting things to toss around. But ultimately, I think it's sort of like baseball and their human constructions. And I'm really intrigued by your claim that there's a difference between them.
Yeah.
And I think about that a lot, but that's what I am.
So and that's helpful. And we can move on. But the thing I want to, because I think I agree with you that it would be too quick to say, to sort of jump from utilitarianism is wrong, therefore God. What I want to say is sort of a different. I don't know if it's sort of it's more along the lines of what C.S. Lewis sort of does in Mere Christianity, where there's a sort of perceptual content to moral outrage. And what I want to say is what best accounts for what we're experiencing when we experience moral outrage, or what we're perceiving when we experience, when we seemingly perceive something worthy of moral outrage. And I think what best accounts for whatever is on the other end of moral outrage is a non-utilitarian sort of a non-utilitarian theory, or whatever's sort of being perceived is not described best in utilitarian terms. What do you think about that sort of claim? So it's not God yet.
Yeah, no, it's intriguing to me. I'm initially uncomfortable with how much work moral outrage is doing in your theory.
Sure.
Because that in itself can be a social construction. I mean, moral outrage,
Yeah. Okay, so that's really interesting. So I don't take emotion. I think emotions can be socially conditioned for sure. But I actually don't take emotions themselves to be social constructs. So for instance, like fear can be socially conditioned. I can be socially conditioned to be unjustly afraid whenever I see a black person, on the street. Like that's possible. But the fear itself isn't the social construct, but rather the way I've been conditioned is sort of a social conditioning, if that distinction makes sense.
Are you not now that your dog is growling?
No, she's all bark, no bite.
Sorry, go
ahead. This happens in all of my videos, actually. She just joins, she just inserts herself.
It's cute.
So what I want to say is that with moral outrage, the emotion itself, even though it can be, and certainly is, moral knowledge can be conveyed through social institutions and social channels, but the emotion itself seems to be a kind of perceiving of something. And it seems to be something that we come equipped with, so like it's not, moral outrage isn't necessarily like any emotion. Like I don't really sort of take my emotion sort of from out there in the ether and then acquire it. It's just sort of something that's part of my equipment.
Yeah. So that I will make a note of that and think about that. I'm just not, I'm not seeing how you get around that social constructive aspect of moral outrage, but that's a really nice sort of summation or intriguing theory that wrongness is that which best accounts for moral outrage. Would that be a good way to put this thing in?
That's great. Yeah. Yes. Yep.
That something is wrong if it's being wrong best accounts for our moral outrage about it.
Yes, that's a great way to put that.
Okay, let me that's nice. I like that. I'm not in agreeing. I'm not, that my mind's churning with things I don't like about it, but I love that you've put something in a nice workable little line there, and ponder that a lot.
Yeah, and please do let me know objections to that as I'm just for my own benefit too, as I'm thinking through that.
Because of course the evolutionary neurobiologists are going to have lots to say about moral outrage, as they're going to view it. You don't think it's socially conditioned. It's something fundamentally different from just the temper tantrum. I don't know that area at all, so that's probably where there's going to be a rich battle on that, So,
and and it's not to say that evolution couldn't play any sort of role in how moral knowledge is formed, but it would be to say that the environment that we're in is such that the development of moral outrage is fitted to a reality in that environment, which moral outrage perceives.
I don't like perceives, because that begs the question of whether you're like, I perceived a ghost. No, you didn't.
Moral outrage potentially perceives.
Okay, good. Good. I like working that out. Very, very interesting.
Great. Okay, great. So I want to then move on also to sort of what you think about the argument from beauty. as well. So, and it might be the case. I know we talked a little bit about it on Twitter, but I believe you're an aesthetic sort of relativist. Would that be correct?
I'm I I am exactly whatever I am on morality, I am with
Okay.
aesthetics, but
Okay.
probably even more so.
Okay.
So I
Great.
think I'm an aesthetic anti-realist. I what exactly if someone says sunsets are not beautiful,
Yeah.
I don't know how to. I don't think there's an argument against that. I don't think there's a
Yes.
truth of the matter, you know.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. They did some study. I think it was a study about um, uh, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. A lot more people agreed with that than morality is in the
Totally.
eyes of the beholder.
Yep. Totally.
But I
Yeah.
kind of think they're both in the eyes of the beholder. But
Yeah. Yeah. So here's then what I'd want to sort of how I'd want to come at this. So it's something at some point I will write this. I haven't yet. We'll see what happens. Called what I've called sort of the beatific argument against naturalism. So playing on Plantinga, but from an aesthetic point of view, it seems that given a purely evolutionary explanation for human origins, that our psychology should be explained in terms of orientation towards survival. So orderedness towards whatever helps us survive. So why do we make friends? Friendships help form social bonds, which help us secure certain goods, which are conducive to survival. What I think I'd want to say is when I think about the experience of beauty, right? No one, at least for me, like I don't necessarily. I can't think of a time where I look at a sunset in order to secure some other good. So beauty has a kind of ultimacy to it where I seek it for its own sake. And it's actually not, it doesn't seem to help me survive in terms of securing some other good. Now it might sort of help you survive in terms of being like, well, it's nice, it sort of lifts you up. But that fact in itself means that it seems to be something that my psychology is ordered towards as an end in itself, which doesn't seem to fit with the purely evolutionary explanation of human origins. So, what do you think about that sort of argument?
I would want to know how you can explore the innermost reaches of your psyche sufficiently to know that you just look at the sunset as an end in itself.
Sure, sure,
You know,
yeah,
because you know, it reminds you of the lovely vacations your family took to the beach when you were a
sure,
kid, or it means it's bedtime and I'm going to get to go curl up in my bed and be safe. I mean,
sure,
there's innumerable explanations for it have nothing to do with it being really beautiful.
sure, sure. So, even if I think what I'd want to say is, even if, so just sort of bracketing the question of whether beauty is objective or not, whether the experience of beauty accords with a kind of evolutionary explanation of human origin, a purely evolutionary explanation of human origins. I think, like, so you're right that from that just the experience of a sunset, I think it's true that I couldn't conclude that. But then when I think about a number of different like all sorts of aesthetic experiences. So, for instance, I seek a sunset for its own sake. It seems like I seek symphonies for their own sake. It seems like I read poetry for its own sake and not for something else that it reminds me of. All of those aesthetic experiences seem to be sought for their own sake, such that even if there are attendant sort of psychological factors that might dispose me towards that, nevertheless, I'm seeking them just to secure them in their own, or to have them in their own right.
Yeah, I would push back on that and be very agnostic about that. I mean,
Mm,
because and not just as a purely theoretical issue. I wonder when I'm going to intellectual things like the symphony, to what extent, I mean, I love Bach, but to what I could watch it on YouTube. To what extent am I going to the symphony to be seen?
oh,
Or
interesting. Yeah,
Vegas
yeah,
treatment, there's
yeah.
a whole bundle of motivations and meanings
Sure.
that we attach to going to the symphony. And I really don't think, as a matter of pure neuropsycho fact, that it's just an end in itself to hear the music.
Do you
Why do we
think?
dress up? Why do we invite our friends? Why do we don't need to do any of that if
Yeah.
it's just for the music? There's a lot more to it. So I'm going to push back on that.
Yeah. So I agree. Like going to a symphony there can be multiple motivations for going to a symphony. Do you think it's compatible with sort of evolutionary psychology if one of those motives is beauty for its own sake?
I don't know how we would hook you up to the most super advanced brain scan and say, okay, there's to impress the women. There's because your mother, your mother died recently and that you're grieving over her and she always loved this symphony. So you're going to do that to get some healing. There's all those motives. How do you exclude those and then here's the one that says it's for its own beauty? How do we do that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't even know what that would look like.
Yeah. And so that's a fair point. I think it seems so when I give at least some account of my own desires and motivations. So let's say I say I eat a steak because I'm hungry, right? It seems like that's I can tell the truth about that. Like, and even if that's not an exhaustive account of like why I'm choosing steak, it seems like I can at least tell the truth, even if it's not a sort of exhaustive psychological profile for why I'm choosing steak to satisfy hunger.
So I'm sorry. Can we just make would it undermine your point or would it not fit your point if we just said eat because I'm hungry? Don't make it a steak, because I can think of lots of other non-nutritional reasons why you would choose steak. So can we just say I eat because I'm hungry, or does it have to be?
Yeah. So that's interesting. So the question there is my eating steak, is that? Yeah, that's interesting.
There's a bundle of meanings around eating steak. I'm vegan. I eat tofu, and there's a bundle of. I don't just eat it because I'm hungry. I eat it because that's part of my identity and my politics. So can we? I think it serves your purpose for this point to just say I eat because I'm hungry.
Yeah. So that's interesting. That's really interesting. Would you say then? Yeah, I need to think more about that. That's fair. Yeah, I need to think
about there was this really odious, famous rocker. I can't remember his name. The lead guitar player for Kiss. I don't know that band at all, but Gene somebody, and he's known to be a real jerk. And he says, I read him once an interview with him in Rolling Stones 20 some years ago, where he says, guys, you just want to learn to play guitar to get laid. And I've been playing guitar my whole life, including pre-puberty, right?
Yeah.
And I know, as to the best of my knowledge, I did not learn the guitar for that purpose.
Right.
But it got me thinking, and I thought, well, God, how do I know? Sure. And I actually was teaching a guitar class once in North Carolina, and there was a pretty famous philosopher of religion, and you probably know who it is. I won't name him, but I told the class about this, and he just raised his hand and said, I'm a counterexample to that. I do not play the guitar to get laid. And I just thought, well, how do you really know that? I mean, it's like, it's one of those psychological warfare things that comes up all the time. I mean, Christians use it on us atheists all the time. You just are an atheist because you want to keep sinning.
Yeah.
So I think I have my reasons here. They are, but God, I don't know. And
so that's okay. So that's actually very helpful, because I don't have that same sort of skepticism towards motivation, which is why, like, even if there are motives I can't see, which is why I actually don't use that line on atheists. Like, I don't think it's helpful. I think it can come across as actually gaslighting at its worst. So I think because motives are one of those things that are intrinsic to consciousness. And I know how do I know I'm seeing redness in the corner of the screen, right? Well, kind of just because I'm experiencing it, right? It's kind of just properly basic. I think the same thing would be true about motives. Now, it might be true that there are motives I can't see,
Yeah.
but at least from what I can tell of my own sort of equipment, I'm rational to communicate to others what I'm feeling, what I'm motivated by, as far as I can perceive them. And so when I apply that to beauty, it seems like I really do seek beauty as an end in itself at certain times.
Yeah. Yeah, I would want to know a lot more about what that bundle of impulses is that creates the motivation to look at a sunset. And I'd really question that it can be, or then it can be isolated to, it's beauty in itself. It's probably also a social construct. Would you agree that sunsets are the beauty that we see in sunsets are a social construct?
So I would want to say our perception of it is conditioned by social factors, but I actually don't think the beauty itself is.
Yeah.
That goes to sort of aesthetic objectivism, but
Yeah.
I think it's true that our perception can be socially conditioned. But it does seem like, even given that, like there have been times I've looked at sunsets with friends, right? But then there are plenty of times I look at it for my own sake. It seems like that, at least. And insofar as I'm at least rational to trust sort of my own motivational structures. It's the ones I can perceive. It seems then rational to say it really does actually seem like I'm just looking at it for its own sake.
Yeah. I'm sorry to be so disagreeable. I'm not just
No, that's okay.
How can I disagree with him? I mean, but it's I spent 3 or 4 days up on a Hopi reservation in, I think it was Arizona, one of those states. Sorry, a few years ago. And when I got there, I was just struck at how drab it was. It was just brown.
Yeah.
Brown. And after about 3 or 4 days, I saw all these beautiful shades of brown. And it was like as beautiful as looking at a sunset. And I don't think anything changed in my perception of beauty. I think a lot of changed in my conditioning.
So that's interesting. So so an aesthetic realist would say the social conditioning sort of opened up your eyes to beauty that was there. And
that could be. And then the question becomes, well, Sean, how do we know there even is a truth of the matter about this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Yep. So that would go to the idea, and I think probably some of the objections to this will be similar to the ones to morality, but that there are wrong things to actually derive aesthetic pleasure from. So, for instance, if someone saw another person getting tortured in a movie or something like that, and they don't. It's not like they go and torture people, and they don't they when they see torture in real life, or if they were to see it, they would stop it. But if they see it in a movie and they're just like, "Gosh, that's beautiful," right? I kind of think like something's wrong with that person.
Can you give an aesthetic example? I mean, because torture doesn't strike me as an aesthetic example.
A
moral example. Give me an example of something that's purely aesthetic that it would be wrong to take pleasure in.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Pile of dog shit.
Yeah, there we go. I think if someone said that was beautiful, like I think there's actually something wrong. Like it seems like there's something wrong there.
I don't know. What if it was sort of beautifully swirled like a nice vanilla ice cream cone
so that's
with
really
a tail at the top?
So that's really interesting. Then it would be not the dog poop itself, but the shape.
You can say shit. It's okay. No, I'm kidding you. So it wouldn't be the dog poop itself. It would be the way it was formed.
Right, the shape there. But if someone were to say the poop in and of itself is beautiful, that there seems to be something really wrong there.
Well, can't you say that about the Mona Lisa? Look, it's the way the paint is formed that is beautiful.
Yeah, interestingly, so that's a great question. I think there's something so of course in classical theories of beauty, right? A lot of them rely on form. And things like form and harmony and proportion and things like this.
Yeah.
I think there's something to that. Now, and we can talk about these reasons, but reasons I think Plotinus sketches. I don't think that's the whole story, but I do think there's actually something really deeply to the idea that form has a lot to do with aesthetics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Could you just tell me what it means? We've gone over killing is wrong, but what does it mean to say sunsets are beautiful? Would it be the same thing that you did with wrongness? Something is wrong because that's the best account of my outrage about it.
Right. Yep. And something is so and that's great. Yeah. So the reality of beauty, something is beautiful if it's sort of the best account or is it's the best account of the fittingness of aesthetic experience or aesthetic emotion, something like that.
It's beautiful because it's the best account of my pleasure.
So interestingly, it's interesting. So Aquinas was okay with using the term pleasure. Aesthetic delight or pleasure, it seems experientially different than, like, when I look at a sunset, that experience feels different. It is a kind of pleasure for sure, but it's a different kind of pleasure than like the pleasure of sex or the pleasure of eating food, or like there's a difference. There seems to be a difference there. So yes, pleasure, but there's a particular kind of pleasure, and we could call it delight. Whatever sort of best accounts for the fittingness of delight.
Yeah. Pleasure can sound a little trite. I get it. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So even though Aquinas uses it, interesting.
So beauty, something is beautiful if finish the sentence for me. Something is beautiful because
if it sort of that's a really, so I have an ontological claim for that.
Okay. I'd love to hear it.
Yeah, well, so it's in the full work aesthetic theory, it's something is beautiful if it serves as a memory of God's triune love. But I don't think we could get even remotely close to that so far. That comes from other sort of considerations about like beauty as generative and beauty as I don't know if you're familiar with Elaine Scarry's on beauty and being just.
No.
So there are a number of like and actually Plato makes this observation too, that beauty sort of begets things in the heart. So someone might experience beauty and then they generate like a work of poetry, or they generate music in response to things like this. So the fully worked aesthetic theory is that beauty is that which is the impression of triune love in created things. And the way I argue for that, that's going to be more or less plausible to someone depending on other things. Other things like, do they think the Christian God is plausible, or do they think it's plausible Jesus rose from the dead? What I argue for, at least in terms of the plausibility of it, is that beauty seems to have these features that fit the features of the triune God. So, for instance, I pointed out generativity. Ultimacy is another one of them. That we seek it as an end in itself, and that it engenders in the classical tradition. It's interesting because Plotinus, Plato, Marsilio Ficino, and a lot of other writers correlate beauty with love. Interestingly, love is said to be sort of the emotion that beauty answers to beauty. It sort of draws forth love, and so that's, in my mind, a sort of, it fits in a world in which the triune God is sort of impressing his nature onto things through beauty. That is love in its wake.
So this is very, very intriguing. Run this by me with a sunset. How does sunset generate triune stuff?
Yeah. Great. Okay. Yeah, good question.
Well, what are the three things it generates in the aesthetic experience of a sunset?
Yeah, great question. So it's not so much that it generates three things, but that it's impressing an aspect of God's triune life into the heart, and the heart is perceiving, whether one knows it or not, It's perceiving and delighting in some sort of aspect or one of the contours of triune love in the being of God. So like the classic doctrine of the Trinity goes something like this. And you might be familiar with this, so forgive me if you already are familiar with this. But that there are God is three in person, one in being. Person being sort of who you are, or describing who-ness, and being describing whatness. So we are two humans and two persons. We're the same kind of being, but we're not the same being. Whereas in the Trinity, God is one in being, so the three persons are not the same kind. There is just one divine being, eternally, what we say, subsisting as three persons. And if we sort of press into that, the notion of the Trinity is this idea that the Father is eternally giving all that he is over to the Son, and the Son is eternally receiving and returning that back to the Father in the bond of love of the Spirit. So there's this threefold replication of the divine nature, or this threefold giving of the divine nature from the Father to the Son, and then back from the Son to the Father in the Holy Spirit. So like sort of with that background, my experience of beauty, at least the claim is that it's an aspect or some sort of excellency that's latent within triune love, impressing itself onto the heart, which is why it leaves something like love in its wake, where it leaves something like the experience of gratuity in its wake. But I totally get like that. Again, that'll sound more or less plausible depending on other things.
Yeah, it's not even that. I'm not even concerned right now with the plausibility of it. I'm trying to figure out what exactly that all means. And I'm also curious, let's say, would that theory work just as well if God were a duality?
Yeah, good question. I don't think so.
Or if you grew up with God as a quadrinity,
good question.
I mean, you're very smart. Couldn't you have found a way to make quadrinity work for your aesthetic theory? I mean, I bet.
Yeah, good question. Yes. Yeah. That's a really good question. So a part of that is going to, I do think that this, if I use this sort of argument for beauty for the Trinity, just, without any sort of like argument from the resurrection or anything like that, like there is this kind of, I don't know that works, but I do think there's something fitting about the notion of love being a threefold movement, between lover, beloved, and then their relationship. So we sort of talk about lovers in terms of their relationship or them. So I think that classical sort of Augustinian picking up on on love as having this triadic movement, there's something fitting about that, I think, at least to my mind. Now, could someone say, well, someone who believed in a quadrinity or was a Unitarian could make a similar argument? Maybe. I'd love to hear it and then interact with it. But it seems like there's something fitting about love being a threefold movement.
I mean, this is all new to me, but I bet you could make that argument if you were given that assignment. I mean, yeah, we won't have time to get into this, but one of it's one of the things I'm very suspicious of, especially in Catholic philosophy, what little I know of it, is this tendency to this willingness to compartmentalize things.
Sure.
I mean, there's this aspect of the Trinity, and then there's this aspect of the Trinity, and this aspect of the Trinity. Like these are neat compartments, and we see this in Thomism all the time.
Yes.
The will versus the intellect. Well, God, those aren't necessarily two different. Hook yourself up to a brain scanner, and you're not going to. There's the will over there, and there's the intellect over there, and here's desire, and here's motivation. These are categories. These are pragmatic categories that help us make sense of a booming, buzzing confusion of data. And I'm just really fundamentally suspicious of trying to build aesthetic or moral theories out of them. But that's my unlearned response.
No, that's fair.
Very interesting stuff you just said, which is very interesting to me.
I'd love to. So once you get into, what a Thomist will actually say eventually is that will and intellect and God are identical. So they actually do. It's interesting because in their system they actually do account for that. and they want to say that will and intellect, and they actually admit these are sort of like these are categorizations, but in reality, these things sort of work in harmonious ways in us. And the reason for that, according to them, is because in God, will and intellect are actually identical.
Yeah,
and it helps, which is really interesting. And I think there's something to that. But I do. I do agree that if beauty sort of were my only argument for the Trinity, I don't know that it would be that compelling. Yeah. I think there's a fittingness to beauty in the Trinity, but I could also see why one could push back on that. So then what I want to move on to potentially is the if you're good to move on to it, is sort of the evidence for the resurrection.
Oh boy, yeah, okay.
Yeah, which is a big one, so I'm sure you're sort of you've read Lacona, you've read sort of the minimal fact stuff. What for you are some of your hesitations about that data?
When I think of the resurrection and all these brilliant people and Habermas doing his 4 million page treatise on everything that one could ever know about the resurrection, it's very impressive, mind-bogglingly complex, and after a few years of trying to follow that stuff, I've become a little weary and bored with it, because I keep thinking that the resurrection, trying to figure out what happened at the resurrection or what accounts for the resurrection belief, what really happened, is a little bit like having 2% of the pieces in a massive jigsaw puzzle, right? We don't have anywhere near the pieces that we need. So much has been lost.
Sure.
And the only responsible thing to do is to be agnostic about it and say, look, even if the bodily resurrection of Jesus is the abductive proof, the inference to the best explanation right now, it's the best explanation right now. The best explanation can still be a very bad explanation if we're working with too little data.
Sure.
We know lots of stuff has been lost. I mean, of course it has. We don't know how Joseph of Arimathea spent his weekend, right?
Sure.
Did his wife say, "You get that damn criminal out of our family tomb right now, buddy"? And so he waited till this. Of course, it was the Sabbath, right? Or it was the Passover. So he had to wait till Passover was over. But maybe he got there before the women on Sunday morning and moved the body because it was his family tomb, and this was just a temporary thing. We just don't know. And there's so much. What went on psychologically with the disciples?
Sure.
They were supposedly convinced by certain things that happened. These reports came decades later about what exactly happened to the disciples, but there's so much that happened with the disciples psychologically. How did they form their belief that Jesus rose from the dead? What exactly did they believe? Did they do a Pascalian wager? Did the disciples possibly say, boy, our ass is grass one way or another, the Romans are going to get us, or Jesus is going to get us when we die. So let's just go and, there's only a 10% chance Jesus rose from the dead, but it's a wise thing to wager on because we don't have anything else. So they lived as if they believed the resurrection until martyrdom. I mean,
sure.
This is all speculation, but we speculate because the evidentiary record is so minimal. One last thing on this. It's sort of like a crime scene. Prosecutors and police detectives showing up at the crime scene a decade after it happened when 95% of the evidence is gone. Sure, they can take the 5% of the evidence and form a reasonable opinion about where it points given its inadequacy. And that's what I think about resurrection discussions, is they're doing a great job figuring out where this woefully inadequate evidence points given its inadequacy. But we all really care about the other 95% that we will never have.
Sure.
Does that make sense? Sorry, it's a little.
It does.
Throwing a lot.
And that's fair. So here's the piece I would want to add. So I think that's fair as it stands. The piece I would want to add to this case that I don't think Habermas would, and a part of this is because of my own ecclesial tradition, right? I'm a high church Anglican, is actually the existence of the church. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Is that it seems to me that what happened so that there actually is some concrete effect through history that you can actually see and touch and experience, namely the church. So it seems like what happened in when Jesus died and when he allegedly rose from the dead is that there was a community of people founded by the apostles. And what I mean by founded is that the apostles went to different places and sort of they preached the gospel. They seemed to think that, and one of the reasons I think they seemed to think there was at least more than a 10% chance is because, Paul says, if I'm wrong, I've been found to misrepresent God, right? Like there were very few atheists at that time.
Yeah.
And so they thought, like, if they got it wrong, they were proclaiming a false Messiah, in which case they would fall under divine judgment. So they have actually a reason to at least be sincere, even if it's not true. So these apostles, though, nevertheless, they preach to these different places and establish these communities that then extend through history and attest to the fact that the apostles genuinely seemed to believe it. And these communities, at least in the first 4 centuries of church history, now, like it's more complicated after Constantine, but in the first 4 centuries, they seem to endure against both what the culture would preach, and they endure against persecution. And my argument there isn't that necessarily proves that Jesus rose from the dead, but what that fits is this idea that the apostles really did think Jesus rose from the dead. And for whatever reason, these Gentiles, these pagans, were actually willing to form these communities that then have a chain of succession that go on from one generation to another, really believing something and proclaiming something that they know sounds foolish to the rest of the culture. That seems to fit better in a world where Jesus really did rise and really is empowering this community. But what do you think about that sort of argument?
I think even if that fits better, you've still got 98% of the jigsaw puzzle pieces are lost forever. And I don't see how you get around that.
So yeah, tell me a little bit about
Dale Allison, the New Testament scholar, Christian New Testament scholar, in his latest book, thinks theft, the body was stolen, is plausible, and there was grave theft of holy men. Their organs were considered had healing magical powers, so bodies got stolen. We know that about that time. There for other reasons we know. And what about the body got stolen and then it set off some freaky stuff and the rumors started flying and people got excited, and you're putting a lot of faith in sort of this algorithmic view that disciples form their decisions rationally, but they were and the psychology of decision making under stress is very clear that people make bad decisions under stress. They perceive things badly under stress. And the early Christians were under a hell of a lot of stress. Fact that by the 4th century or the 2nd century, this was a high intensity, high enthusiasm movement, I don't see the need for a supernatural explanation for that.
So then
there could have been one, but we don't need that.
Okay. So let's explore that at that early stage. I think with Dale Allison, because you're right, he argues that, but that means he actually thinks there was probably an empty tomb.
Yeah,
if he thinks the body was stolen. And so what I want to add is that what the communities of the church show us is that oftentimes I think we hear these construals by someone like Bart Ehrman, who, it starts with a small claim and then the claim sort of gets blown into something bigger than it was. I think actually what the reason I brought up the community of the church is because I think it actually attests to the idea that the apostles were actually proclaiming something that was like pretty definable very early. That they were saying that actually Jesus rose after 3 days. He died, he was buried, and he appeared. That there's that creedal quote unquote statement in 1 Corinthians 15. He died, he appeared to Peter, then the 12, then to,
500.
allegedly the 500 and James and all this stuff.
Mhm.
What that shows us, and what the community in its immediate wake shows us, is that the apostles were actually preaching something with a pretty clearly defined structure in the immediate wake of the Christ event, and the immediate wake of whatever happened. And it seems then that it wasn't just that they were sort of proclaiming something vague that got blown up, but they were proclaiming something very specific that they seemed to believe. Would you agree with that statement?
None of the apostles wrote anything, right? Do we agree on that? I mean,
Paul wrote the
disciples. No, the disciples. Sorry,
Oh.
the disciples. Yeah, the disciples.
Yeah, probably not themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we know what they
question.
were preaching? I mean, we can
Yep.
speculate, but let me. I mean, rather than hash out the entire resurrection thing, I'll tell you one of my big areas of discomfort with what you're saying is if God became flesh, God came to earth because he had this massively important message for us. Our eternal well-being depends on this message and on Jesus dying for this message and on this message getting out. Why the hell is the message so messy?
Good question. Yeah. Yep.
And Jesus spent 3 years teaching these 12 disciples. They still didn't get it when he died, and he had to give them another 40-day crash course. But he invested his teaching in these 12 people, minus Judas, and then someone replaced Judas. And who wrote the New Testament? None of them.
Sure.
And it all just seems implausible to me. And then people tell me, Steve, who are you to second guess God? Well, I'm just saying what I think. This does not smell like a divine mission here. It smells like the way stupid human beings get their movements started. It's really messy. And I think there would be more evidence of the divine in early Christianity if it were in fact divine.
Sure.
And that's a big picture objection.
Yeah. So that's really helpful. I think the way I'd sort of want to reframe that and say, I do think that in terms of the messiness of the message, there's sort of two ways to think about that. So tell me what you're getting, and you might be getting at both senses. That are you saying the message is unclear, or that the evidence is unclear, or sort of both?
Both, but right now I'm talking about the message is unclear.
Okay.
Peter and Paul disagreed. Okay, apparently they resolved it. I don't know if they resolved it. Luke says they resolved it, but Luke was pro Paul. So, there was early disagreement, but to this day, if I line 10 dedicated Christian scholars, bring them or ask them, what must I do to be saved? They don't even have that message down.
Good question.
That's like a divine, a perfect being with that kind of important message would make damn sure you guys get that clear at least. We can dig around and circumcision and eating food from the blood of animals, but here's what you need to do to be saved, and don't mess around with this. And look where we are 2,000 years later. Massive disagreement over what one must do to be saved.
So that's really helpful. I would actually disagree with that. I think most Christians actually agree that what the minimal you need to do to be saved is believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, and then confess him as Lord. And that should be summed up in baptism, right? So even a Baptist who doesn't think baptism is necessary to salvation in any sense will still say one should get baptized, and if they don't, that's a problem. Like, that could throw doubt on their faith, right?
Do we need to believe Jesus was God?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I'd say you confess him as Lord, and then when you press into that, that's when you start to find out these other things. So what heresy is, and what damning heresy is the denial of something that follows from the apostolic teaching, that's either taught by them or very closely follows, right? So we would say that when we confess Jesus as Lord in Romans 10:9, that's using the word Kyrios, which is quoted. Paul quotes Joel 2:32 in Romans 10:13 and applies that to Jesus. And that in Joel 2:32, it's about Yahweh. So he's applying a Yahweh text to Jesus when he says confess him as Lord. So we would then say, as you work things out, you then come to, full creedal Christianity. But you actually don't need to right then and there have a full understanding of the Trinity to be saved. An understanding of the Trinity unfolds from what you initially believe to be saved.
What are there any propositions that one must assent to in order to be saved?
Yes, yeah. That God raised Jesus from the dead, and that Jesus is the Lord of all.
And the Lord of all means God?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, so it would mean Yahweh. It would mean, the sense in which Paul means it seems to be Yahweh in Joel 2:32.
But then why are there subordinationists in the earliest Christianity, including in the Gospels, that needed to be textually improved because they had subordinationist hints in them?
So I do know Ehrman argues that. I would push back on him with that. But I think a part of it is because as soon as you have the propositions, the Father is God, Jesus is God, the Holy Spirit is God, right? Naturally, and I think rightfully so, the mind asks, okay, if there's only one God, and these three are not each other, how does that work? And subordinationism is kind of an early attempt that goes wrong. But I actually don't think in those, damning heresy is this sort of knowing coming to an understanding of what the apostles taught, and then knowingly and willfully rejecting it. So that's actually why most of us don't think that, Justin Martyr, who maybe was a subordinationist, most of us wouldn't say he was damned. And the reason is because the church is still working out its confession, and Justin Martyr's trying to work out its confession. And he didn't even necessarily know of Nicaea to deny Nicaea, right? Nicaea is sort of the end of this process of reflection. So, I would say that one doesn't necessarily need to have full Trinitarian doctrine yet to be saved. But it will unfold from what they confess and from what you need to believe to be saved.
So you're kind of helping me with my point here, which is that this sure sounds complicated, John, and not many people on the history of the last 2,000 years of the planet have the opportunity to actually figure this out. There are, maybe you refer to the passage in Joel, what was the passage?
Joel 2:32. Yeah.
You're getting right there. You're getting pretty scholarly.
Sure.
Just reading the New Testament is going to hear. Jesus sure hinted that no one is good. Why do you call me good? Only the Father in heaven is good. There's a whole slew of things, and what that tells me is that we need authorities to tell us what to believe to be saved.
Yes.
But on the other hand, why couldn't that when we pick our authorities? How do we know which authorities to pick?
Yeah, right? Good question. Great question.
Well, why not pick some other? Why not pick the Unitarians or all these other churches? And I just can't escape this thought that you guys are brilliant, but why would we need your brilliance to help plebs like me come to a salvific understanding? And and I've had the luxury of doing a lot more work on this than someone in Uganda who's trying to keep their hut from getting burned down by the enemy tribe. They need that message as much as you and I do, and it's not really available to them unless the right kind of missionaries show up. And Why
Sure.
is it that way when Jesus promised that the Spirit is going to come and
Yeah.
teach you in all things?
Yep.
Why?
Yep.
Why do we need you guys in your fancy
Good question.
exegesis and hermeneutics and learning Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic,
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff? It seems like there's an air of elitism
Sure.
about the religion that you guys can sit in the eye. And I don't mean this as a put down. I mean, you guys. I mean, I love sitting in the ivory towers with Dominicans and dealing with this stuff. And I want to do a lot more of it in the fall when I do my master's at some Catholic school, right? But the fact that is such an important part of understanding what one must do to be saved bothers me. I think that counts a point against you.
Sure. Yeah. So let me rephrase. So I do agree with you that actually that if one was left to just read scripture by itself, like, and they didn't have any sort of authority, that would be a problem.
Yeah.
I actually don't think the Bible is that sort of text. So,
right.
As some high church Anglican,
right. Here comes the high church.
Yeah, right. I actually do believe in an authority structure that Jesus instituted to actually shepherd the church, which they would have called presbyters at first, and with a ruling presbyter over the other ones, which we now call bishops, priests, and deacons. So I think there is that structure. Now there's that second objection. Okay, well, if there is that structure, how do we identify the right ones?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the church actually had an answer to this too, and it was those in succession. So who could actually trace their lineage back to the apostles? And you actually could do this pretty early on. So Irenaeus talks about, like, he gives us sort of which apostles ordained who where. And so very early on, he's actually saying the Gnostics can't do this. They can't trace their lineage back to the apostles. We can. Those of us who stand in this apostolic lineage therefore teach these communities what the apostles have handed down. Now, then the third problem that one could raise to that you raised is, well, isn't that elitist? I think, the structure of human society seems to be naturally hierarchical. So just, if someone starts an organization, just socially we tend towards hierarchy. So part of the reason I think for this hierarchical structure is because it accords with human nature, and the bishops, if they're doing their jobs rightly, actually then bring the rest of the church along. So what's supposed to happen is that the bishops and priests found, they train their people to read and to listen and to be a literary people. Early on, you actually had the founding of catechetical schools by bishops and priests that would teach people to read and then train people in doctrine and things like this. We don't do that as much as we should anymore, but we did. Yeah.
So when I'm talking about elitist, I'm not using that as hierarchical. I'm talking about there's people who have the time to study this stuff.
Sure.
Get it. And the rest of us have to go figure out which of these experts is the right one. Is Bart Ehrman right? How do I determine whether you're right or Bart Ehrman's right without sort of getting my own PhD? And I don't have time for that. And most people don't have time to even. So this salvation actually winds up getting conferred or getting conferred very serendipitously by whoever happens to get the right missionary knocking on their door, or whoever it's a fact of geography and where you were born and when you were born. And that doesn't seem consistent with a universal, a divine message that's universally attended, but also, I lost my train of thought. I'll come back to it, but
yeah. Well, so in terms of identifying the right experts, where would you find issue with, like, that idea that at least if Jesus rose from the dead, then at least the claim of the church is that he actually did establish a way to recognize that, which is the succession of bishops.
Yeah, this was my second point, that you're also assuming that God has guided the process of church building very, very, he's micromanaged it so that the right people got to be bishops all the way down. But I don't know why one would. That seems an ad hoc assumption. We know that authority is achieving authority is a very ugly process with corruption and
Yes.
ambition and nastiness and
Yeah.
ego and all that. But in the Christian church, we're asked to believe that God made sure that that didn't get in the way. And I don't know why one would think that. That's other than
Yeah.
some argument about how, well, this was really important.
Yeah.
The stuff was really important, and God didn't micromanage it.
Yeah, I think we can actually show from history that the message didn't change. So like I think you like with the claim is that God in his providence put the right people at the right time. Not necessarily that they were good people. They weren't all the time, right? There were some really bad bishops.
Yeah.
But it's that in his providence, he sort of guided and instituted the right people that would pass along faithfully and preserve this message. And what we can do actually from history is to show that, the apostolic tradition written by Irenaeus actually matches very well what we're still preaching today.
So, but how would I know that? I mean, how would I know that, Sean, without doing this? I mean, without quitting everything and studying that stuff. I mean, that's where the elitist thing comes in from.
Yeah. So
I'm not denying it. I'm saying someone had to figure that out, and it took a lot of centuries of study or decades of study for someone to figure that out. And I don't have time for that, and most people don't.
Yeah, well, so help me unpack that, because it seems like even a lot of lay people, especially in the first millennium, right, when most people are illiterate, and so they really don't have access to the Bible, but they know these names, right? They know Athanasius, they know these names of Irenaeus, they know these saints, they know what they did. So it seems like, at least for a large swath of church history, that knowledge was widespread even among lay people. Who these figures were, and then if someone then asked, like if someone wanted to say, "Well, I don't trust you, Father Brown," like how do I know you're telling me the truth? Father Brown then at that point could say, "Okay, well then you're asking this question so we can actually bring up the resources to show you that this is the case." But it seems like that knowledge that there was this continuous chain and this consistent message, and the knowledge of the particular people who passed it along actually was communicated to the laity for a while. We're undereducated in the American church. We don't really do a good job in the American church.
But it requires a huge amount of effort to educate everybody about this stuff, and it seems to me like a divine being who really needs this message, wants this message to get out for everyone, would have come up with a different system that doesn't involve this sort of complexity and this sort of a very narrow, a very small percentage of the population that God has populated the earth with, actually has access to this. I mean,
the
Nestorians, do you consider them heretics? They were the first ones to reach China. Why did God allow that to happen if he's guiding this process? I mean, we can go on and on with this. Well, if God made sure that message was pure, why did he let so much bad stuff get out here? Why does he allow heresies to deceive, heresies that are non-salvific? If you believe that, you're not saved. There are people who sincerely, just by happenstance of birth and time and location, believe heresies unto their death and die unsaved. Now we can come up with ad hoc hypotheses about, well, on the last moment of death, before they die on their deathbed, God gives them the knowledge. There are people who say that kind of stuff, like God intervenes at the last minute. But why say any of this? Why not just say, look, this was a fully human process. The development of your church was a fully human process. And that's really the burden you have of showing that. And I'm just not sure that finding continuity is going to be enough to have you meet that burden. We know that 100% of all organizations formed through natural causes, except your church. You've got a big burden of showing that yours is the exception. Just like the New Testament. In the last 2,000 years, every single document that has ever been written about any subject was not holy word of God, except these 27 documents right here.
Sure.
If I'm going to say that, I have a massive burden of showing that.
Yes. Yeah.
And showing some plausibility and doing my apologetic homework to find out how it might be that God inspired these. That's not good enough. I've got such a heavy burden that so that's where I am with everything you're saying. That said, I'm intrigued by a lot of what you just said, because I didn't know. I mean, I know who Irenaeus was, but I didn't know that we can look at him and see that this authority was easily traceable or that kind of stuff. But I'm still bothered by how it takes so much work to by this claim that here's why we know that God guided us and nobody else. That just seems really bold and hard to defend.
And so I stake that claim on the resurrection. So the reason I brought up continuity was actually like a pointer back to that
But
evidence.
I'm sorry, but you also stake the resurrection on the existence of the church.
So and what I mean by that is that the existence of the church tells me what the apostles were preaching early on. And that actually diffuses all of these claims of like, well, maybe the apostles preached something vague and it was like blown up out of proportion. So the existence of the church then helps us say, okay, this is actually, the apostles were preaching something very specific early on, and they believed something very specific early on. So that helps us eliminate a number of different kinds of explanations we could give. And I might have been unclear about that. Does that sort of make sense? Because I agree with you. The sheer existence of the church from then till now itself wouldn't, it's there. There are Muslim institutions and other sort of but but it's more so that the fact that there's a church community that sprouts early on helps us then identify what the apostles were actually preaching, and so rule out a number of different kinds of explanations we can give for why they came to preach what they did.
Assuming, Sean, that under tremendous stress of Roman occupation and crucifixions and the bitter disappointment of watching their leader executed and the confusion and the fear for their own lives, etc., that they formed, just that they were not compromised in their belief formation. And I think that's a big assumption that relies on jigsaw puzzle pieces that are permanently lost.
Well, so that's what I dispute. So that's helpful, because I wouldn't want to say that. I would want to say that if they were sort of prone to form a belief, right? It wouldn't have been that Jesus rose from the dead, because there were a number of other Messiah figures on either side of Jesus, right? There was the Bar Kokhba revolt, where he's killed and the followers disperse. At best, they probably would have said Jesus was a kind of martyr, or he was exalted or something like that. But what they were claiming early on is not that he was exalted, but that he's the first fruits of the new creation raised ahead of everyone else. And that's actually a completely unprecedented sort of thing to proclaim, even when your Messiah has just been killed, given that we have instances of that having happened. And so it seems unlikely, if one wanted to say their beliefs sort of formation process was compromised, that's not the sort of belief they would articulate.
Okay, so let me push back here, because this is one of the assumptions of algorithmia that I think is very common in the kind of argument you're making. This sort of idea that, look how unusual it is, first century Jews would not form that belief. Well, we don't know that. New movements with new novel beliefs start under stressful situations all the time. And I just think it's a little bold to say the best explanation from them saying this is that Jesus was exactly who we now say he is. We don't really know that. That involves knowing a lot more. That involves a lot more pieces to the jigsaw puzzle.
So in isolation, yes, it would be that paired with the fact that, as Dale Allison seems to agree, there really was an empty tomb, paired with this idea that Paul can attest to having seen Jesus, and and Peter and the 12 saw Jesus. Whatever we do with the 500, Peter and the 12 and James. So all of them. So it's when we put those three things together that where the tomb is empty, you have Paul and the 12 and James having seen Jesus, and the unlikeliness of that particular belief. Those three things together seem to be difficult to explain any other way than
Paul didn't see Jesus. Paul had a vision of Jesus. So we can bicker about that, but the disciples didn't write anything themselves.
Sure.
And there's also getting back to the what happened on that weekend. We know that there was an empty tomb. I mean, I'm with you there. I think, I don't know, but most New Testament scholars believe, even including skeptics, think there was an empty tomb. We know that, I'm getting back to did Joseph of Arimathea move the body, or was it stolen, or whatever? We know that the earliest gospel, assuming it's Mark, says that the women showed up at the tomb after the Passover and when it was light. Okay, so Mark would have provided a window of opportunity for Joseph of Arimathea to move the body. Then we have Matthew and Luke, the next gospels, coming along saying, well, it was kind of at twilight, or I don't remember what exactly they said, but it could have been dark, it could have been light. And then we have John solving the problem by saying it was still dark.
Sure.
Now, what do we make of those kinds of things? And I don't have the passages memorized, but you have, the problem is, did somebody move the body at the immediate, when the sun rose? Did they steal the body? Mark allows for that possibility because it was light when the women showed up. Someone could have been there earlier and taken the body. Matthew and Luke are vague on whether it was there. And then John fixes the problem by saying it was still dark. Those are the kinds of things that I don't want to make too big a deal out of them, but something's going on there. I mean, it could just be coincidence, but I haven't heard anybody talking about that, and I think that's something that smells suspicious. And there's a lot of stuff like that. I also wonder why this apostolic succession thing. I mean, I heard Trent Horn and Gavin Ortlund debating. I watched their 2-hour debate on Sola Scriptura. There's a lot of disagreement about apostolic succession, and it's a hugely significant part of your version of Christianity. And
so I would count Gavin's a friend of mine. I definitely count him as a brother in Christ.
Oh yeah. No, and he's brilliant. I'm a big fan, even though I don't share his. I mean, he's a great guy to watch, and I want to learn more from him. But there's the apostolic succession thing just doesn't seem to be, given its central significance to the future of the Christian religion. Why did Jesus say, hey, gang, write this down? Here's how it's going to work. Why did he leave that all up to human beings to form institutions and have committee meetings and figure this stuff all out? I mean, it just sounds so non-divine to me.
So importantly, apostolic. So the reason I mentioned I think Gavin's a Christian is because I don't think one needs to actually be in a church in succession to be a Christian. So on that level, right, the message is still, even in a church like the one Gavin goes to, it's still, the integrity of it is still there to the extent that one can totally be saved, right, through believing what Gavin does. They can be part of the church in that way. They, upon their baptism, they really are members of the church, even if they're not gathering in a proper community yet. So I do think the message actually has been, preserved to that extent. Now, why go through the trouble of forming a human institution? What I want to say is that the gospel, the goal of salvation, this happens all the time in evangelicalism, where the goal of the gospel is often just to get a ticket out of hell, right? And that's not the goal of the gospel. The gospel is it holistically transforms. Its goal is actually to holistically transform human life and to actually align human life with God, so that humans actually take on more and more of God's character. And so,
sorry, but the hell thing is a big part of it. I mean,
it is, and I don't want to minimize that.
Jesus died so we have everlasting life, not so that we could do what you just said.
Well, so everlasting life is actually, it's defined in a particular way.
Yeah,
it is this idea of going onward and inward into the life of God. And it's true, the alternative to that is judgment, right? Is hell. But salvation is this like journey into the life of God. And so even if someone's not going to hell, right, and so they have the message to that extent, the way in which I would say someone like Gavin is missing out on the fullness of salvation isn't that he's going to hell, but it's that he's not yet in this sort of in God's program of fully renewing human life. And that means that God's actually going to work with human institutions, because that's just part of human life, in order to do that. But he's still preserved the message enough where even someone who doesn't get that fullness can still be saved.
Well, but then why apostolic succession? I mean, if people are actually out forming churches and they don't need to be in the line, as long as they get the message right, it's okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. So that has to do with that idea of sanctification, right? If I go off and form my own church, what that shows is that I actually don't I'm not regarding those who came before me, and I'm seeking to sort of self-assert my authority, right? So someone like Mark Driscoll founds his own church and self-proclaims himself a pastor, and no one has actually vetted him. No one has appointed him. Now, vetting and appointment doesn't guarantee that he will be abusive, but it's an important part of that discernment process.
No, that's a fair. You start your own church, but you may present salvific doctrine and get people saved, but you're not participating fully in the sanctification.
Right.
That makes sense to me. Yeah.
Right.
Hey, on that note of agreement, I should probably wrap. We've gone 2 hours.
Yeah, no problem.
Steve,
thank you so much for coming on. Is there something you'd like to plug? I always want my guests to plug whatever they're doing or whatever they're, so is there something you'd like to plug and share with the audience?
I don't have anything I want to plug. I will say that this has been very intellectually stimulating for me.
Likewise.
I'm overwhelmed. It's funny. Someone, my girlfriend asked me the other day, and I get this from people sometimes. This is not about her. She asked me a similar question, but I often get on social media, why don't you pick on Islam? And I say, I don't know anything about Islam. And then they say, well, why don't you learn something? And I'm just struck by how extraordinarily complicated it is to just get a handle on Christianity. I can't sort of go take Islam up and why Hinduism is wrong, because it's even scratching the surface on a rich religious tradition like Christianity or any world religion is really a lifelong task. And I'm just marveling at, I'm not going to take on any more religions because this is enough work as it is, and very stimulating, very you make a lot of really good points, and I really wish our two camps could sit down and have more discussions like this, where we're not trying to persuade, but we are listening. And so thank you for having me. It's been really good and good to get to know it, and I'd love to do it again after I do some more reading.
Likewise. And hey, you're not just a plebe. You're brilliant. So thank you, and thanks for this has been stimulating for me as well. So thank you for coming on and doing this.
Okay. And after you hit the button, I'll say goodbye properly to you. So
all right, awesome.